Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'd like to welcome you to our Munich Dialogues on Democracy evening, the sources of Chinese conduct, where we'll be looking at whether or not Washington and Beijing are fighting a new Cold War. Tonight, we welcome Professor Odd-Anne Westad from Yale University and ZDF's Ulf Röller, who joins us from Beijing for our conversation. I'm Bartley Grosser-Richter. I'm the founder of Munich Dialogues on Democracy, a cooperation between the Yale Club of Germany and Munich's America House, which is the Bavarian Center for Transatlantic Relations. I am really looking forward to this evening. The topic is absolutely urgent, and I can't think of anyone better to explain it to us than Professor Westad. So before we start, I'd really like to thank our partners at America House because they masterfully handle the logistics and the technology for our events. I'd also like to thank our members, our donors, and our supporters for sticking with us and making these events possible. The coronavirus pandemic has upended all of our lives completely this year. And in Munich, we are entering a stricter lockdown again this week. So I'd just like to say we're very grateful for your continued support. And we'll continue to offer events virtually until in person is possible again. But as I said in September, being virtual does have very concrete advantage in that we can welcome an audience and indeed speakers from around the world. So tonight I am in Munich, Professor Westad is in New Haven, and Mr. Röller is in Beijing. So I'd like to welcome everybody tonight or today, or actually tomorrow, as Beijing is, depending on where you're joining from. Our talk this evening is based on an article that Professor Westad wrote in Foreign Affairs in September 2019, called The Sources of Chinese Conduct Are Washington and Beijing Fighting a New Cold War? Reference is made, of course, to George Kennan's famous 1947 article in the same publication called The Sources of Soviet Conduct, that became the canonical text for those who tried to understand the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, laying out the containment strategy that defined US policy until the end of the Cold War. We are faced with an irresistible analogy more than 70 years later, and explicit calls for a new similar strategy with regards to communist China. But are we really fighting a new Cold War? Professor Arne Westad is the Elihu Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale University. He joined the faculty at Yale after teaching at the London School of Economics and at Harvard University, where he was the S.T. Lee Professor of US-Asia Relations. Originally from Ålesund on the Norwegian coast, he is a fellow of the British Academy, of the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters, and of several other national academies. He's a visiting professor at Peking University and a research associate at the Harvard Fairbanks Center. Professor Westad is also an award-winning author, and he has published 16 books and won as many awards for them. In the first part of his career, he was mainly preoccupied with the history of the Cold War, China-Russia relations, and the history of the Chinese Communist Party. Today, he's mainly interested in researching histories of empire and imperialism, first and foremost in Asia, but also worldwide. And he's also trying to figure out how China's late 20th century economic reforms came into being and how their outcomes changed the global economy. His latest book, The Cold War, A History, came out in 2017 in English, but exactly 1 year ago in German from Klett-Cotta Verlag, and was immediately a bestseller. I'd like to read from a review. They say it's stunning in its breadth and revelatory in its perspective. This book expands our understanding of the Cold War, both geographically and chronologically, and offers an engaging new history of how today's world was created. Even more relevant to our talk tonight is his 2012 book, Restless Empire, China and the World Since 1750. Again, I quote, an in-depth study by one of our most respected authorities on international relations and contemporary East Asian history. Restless Empire is essential reading for anyone wishing to understand the recent past and probable future of this dynamic and complex nation. So there you go. We're not 5 minutes in. I've given you 2 fantastic Christmas gift ideas. He really is the best person to explain the current global tension with China to us. Quickly, after his talk, I am thrilled to welcome Ulf Röller to the conversation, who will moderate a question and answer session for us. Many of you will recognize Mr. Röller immediately. He's an award-winning journalist, currently German broadcaster ZDF's East Asia Bureau Chief, and has been stationed in Beijing since September 2019. Röller is the winner of the 2020 Hans-Joachim Friedrichs Award for Excellence in Journalism, specifically for his reporting out of Wuhan, China on the coronavirus and Hong Kong, the mass pro-democracy demonstrations. Before moving to Beijing, he was in Washington from 2010 to 2019 as bureau chief, so he covered the Obama and Biden administration as well as the Trump administration. Finally, you can ask your questions this evening via the YouTube chat on your screen or via email to event@americahouse.de. That's event@amerikahaus.de. My fantastic partners over there will be fielding the questions for us, and we will try to get to as many as possible in the hour that we have. So with that, Professor Westad, welcome over to New Haven.
Thank you very much, Bartley, and also thank you for that very generous and kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be with you this evening. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I hope that you all will have a chance to look at what I wrote in Foreign Affairs last year. But in case you can't, or in case you want to have a briefer version, there is an update, a follow-up to that article published in Foreign Affairs this morning. I'm going to send you the link. I hope this goes through in chat so that you could have a look at that later on at your convenience. So as I said, it's wonderful to be with you. I'm particularly grateful to the America House and the Munich Dialogue on Democracy. I'm very, very happy that Herr Röller is able to be up in the middle of the night in Beijing to comment on this. So I'll make sure that he has enough space to do so when I finished. So what I'm going to do in the brief presentation at the beginning of this discussion this evening is really to make 2 points. So the first one has to do with the Cold War analogy, which increasingly is being used to characterize US-China relations, both here in the United States, but also in China itself, increasingly so. And then in the second part, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the specifics that I'm preoccupied with in terms of the relationship between the United States and China, the way I see it both today and the way it may develop over the next 4 to 5 years. So much of what I have to say comes out of spending about half the year in China last year, when we could still travel, if you remember that. And the impressions that I had from speaking to friends and colleagues and a very large number of people, including within the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, when I spent some time there. So that's the more direct background for my reflections in speaking to you this evening. So on the first issue of analogies, so being an historian, I'm always very careful with analogies, not mainly because of the academic or intellectual aspect, but because I know that analogies have a tendency to lead us in certain directions when they're applied to policy. When you say that something is almost or exactly like something else, well, then you know roughly the kind of policies that will come out in response to the current situation that you're facing. And my main message with regard to the Cold War analogy is that the relationship between the United States and China today have relatively little in common with the Cold War as an international system. Those of us who know it, maybe particularly in Germany, but across Europe and across the world, will remember the main facets of that conflict well. And for most of them, they do not really fit this situation that we are in at the moment. So some people, again, both here and in Beijing, tend then to say, "Oh, that's good. We're not in a Cold War." But it's not quite as simple as that. The point here is that not all conflicts are Cold Wars. I almost said, unfortunately, particularly when you think about the history of Europe over the past 200 years. There has been worse out there that has ended up in actual cataclysmic wars between great powers. And the other side of my message, unfortunately, to you tonight, is that some of the elements that I see in the current US-China relationship have more in common with those earlier forms of conflict and rivalries, confrontations, than what it has with the Cold War. So let's do the similarities first, because there are some similarities. So China, as Bartley pointed out, is ruled by a communist party, just like the Soviet Union was ruled by a communist party. And communist ideology matters in China. Marxism matters in China, although in rather different ways than what it did in the Soviet Union of old. It's also a similarity, I think, with the Cold War, that many people tend to think about this as a bipolar confrontation, with the United States being the one pole and China being the other. I'm going to talk a little bit more later on about why I think this is an unrealistic perception on a global scale, but it is a perception that is there, and to some extent increasing, I think, both in Washington, irrespective of the administration in charge there, and in Beijing. But I think if you look at the differences, they are much greater than the similarities. So first and foremost, with regard to the Chinese social and economic system. So China, a long time ago, gave up on Marxist and communist rectitude in order to run its economy and organize its population. China today, in spite of the influence that the government has over economic and social affairs, is very different from the Soviet Union of old, domestically as well as internationally. At the international level, the main point for China is to compete and compete within the existing global market system. And as we know, China has done that fantastically well. It is a main reason for China's rise and for the very dramatic change for the better in terms of how China's economy looks when you look at it in a 30-year perspective. So unlike the Soviet Union, which in many ways self-isolated, didn't want to take part in the global economy on capitalist premises, China does the opposite. It goes out, it engages, and it's a much stronger position because of it. Then secondly, this issue of bipolarity that I mentioned, I think some of that will turn out over the next few years to be rather superficial. It's true that China's power, including in strategic terms, has increased dramatically over the past generation. But so has the power of a number of other regional great powers, while that of the United States, relatively speaking, has been in decline. So I don't think it's correct to say that we are heading towards another kind of bipolar conflict. I think the world, in many ways, is becoming more multipolar. I don't think China is going to replace the United States as the globally predominant power, the way the United States practiced its power for 2 or possibly 3 generations. And this has very strong implications for what kind of policy framework one should develop. If I'm right that the world is becoming more multipolar, to some extent based on regions, large regions on a global scale, then one of the implications that this has is, of course, that from a European perspective, maybe particularly, it's important for Europe to find its role within this multipolar world and to start thinking about that now, not when the situation has developed much further in that direction. So much about similarities, comparisons, and then to the reality as I see it today. There is no doubt in my mind that the United States and China is now in a rivalry with an intensity that we haven't seen before in US-China relations. Not even during the Mao Zedong era, because at that point, China was still very much a peripheral power in terms of the international system. Now it is increasingly central, and relations between the two powers are going downhill. Unfortunately, this is not just an invention that comes out of current policies in Beijing and Washington. It is more structural than that. I do think, even though I do not agree with all of his points. I do think my former Harvard colleague Graham Allison has much of this right when he talks about the Thucydides trap, which basically means that it's the fear in a status quo power, a predominant power, in this case the United States, the fear of the increasing power of a rising country, rising great power, in this case China, that leads to war and conflict. I think that covers the situation as we see it today to some extent. There's of course much more to it than that, but this sense that we are in a power shift between the two countries is something that will continue, I think, to fuel confrontations of various sorts. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Irrespective of who is in power in Washington and Beijing. So for those of you who think that the conflict between China and the United States will be gone with a new administration in Washington, or possibly, though I think we must look much further ahead to see it, the end of the Xi Jinping era in China, those who think that are almost certainly wrong. There are structural elements in this that are much deeper than just the matter of who is in power, although, of course, people at the political helm will be able to set both the tone and the direction for much of the practical work that the two are able to do with each other. I'm going to end today by talking a little bit about the United States, but let me first talk about China. This, as I said, comes out from spending almost 6 months in China last year, which changed my views on a few of the developments that we see within the country. It'd be interesting to have Herr Röller's comments on this as well. It changed my views on the degree of repression that you see internally in China. It's much higher than what I thought before I arrived. To give my own background, I first came to China as an undergraduate exchange student back in 1979. So I've seen much of the development that has taken place, the remarkable and successful development that has taken place over these 40 years since I first arrived there. Generally, the change has been for the better. And overall, I think it's still important to say that China is not just a richer, but also a much freer country than the one that I encountered in 1979. But over the last 7 or 8 years or so, the degree of repression by the Chinese Communist Party, by its various organs, has increased. I think to the detriment not just of politics in China and its ability to think about change and about policy directions, but also with regard to how ordinary people lead their lives in China. It also has an impression, I think, that has been sent out from China to the extent that foreigners pick up on this, that China now doesn't seem to be heading in the direction of a more liberal society. Now, there are some reasons for this that are, if not forgivable, then at least understandable. There was a criticism that started before Xi Jinping came to power of Chinese politics and particularly Chinese society as being too liberal, too individualistic, too corrupt, not oriented enough towards the common good and towards achieving development through centralization. I think quite a number of Chinese, even outside of the Communist Party, bought into this story. Now, I'm not quite sure if most of them believed that Xi Jinping would take it quite as far as he has since he became the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. So that's one change that came out of a long stay in China. The second one has to do with the changes in the view of the United States among the Chinese Communist Party's top members, but also to some extent the population itself within China. Many Chinese, including outside the party, are now convinced that the United States has a long-term strategy to bring down the Chinese Communist Party and split up China. This is often what they think when they refer to a new Cold War. It's not a direct link to the mechanisms that fueled the Soviet-American Cold War, but it is a sense that what the United States is after is really to destroy China. So that's a That's a view that has increased. I think it has increased with the Trump administration, but I think it was there well before then. One of the problems here, which I feel is a real problem for policymakers outside of China, is that this image of the United States as, this is a Russian rather than a Chinese term, but the Chinese have now picked up of it, the United States as chaos mongers, as a country that goes out to create trouble for others simply because they believe in chaos. That this resonates with the general public in China in ways that have not been the case before. And of course, a lot of this has to do with the current situation, the political stalemate in the United States, the exceptionally high degree of partisanship in American politics, but also the way in which the United States has completely failed in handling the COVID-19 pandemic. The idea that the United States should be the globally predominant country may have been in free fall in China for some time, but that's certainly been sped up by current events. And then finally on China, before I'll talk a little bit about the United States, China has moved towards a much more assertive foreign policy. First and foremost in the greater Eastern Asian region, so around China's borders. China's very long and complex borders. But also I think this view has been fueled by a sense in Beijing, and this is more the case, I think, among policymakers than among people in general, that US commitments to its friends and allies in Asia is waning. And this is particularly connected to the Trump administration, but again, some of the elements of this were in place during the last phase of the Obama administration as well. And in my view, this is not good. Not because I think the United States forever should necessarily be the predominant power in Eastern Asia, but because I'm worried, and this is where the parallel to the late 19th and early 20th century in Europe is so frightening. I'm worried about power shifts that happen very rapidly, because one of the things that we see historically is that they very often lead to war. So in many ways, this is the worst possible moment for there being any doubt about the US alliance with South Korea or with Japan, or even about the United States building long-term close relationships with Vietnam, with Indonesia, and maybe most crucial of all with India. So I do think that it's important to look at this for the new administration that is coming in the United States, to look at it very early on during the Biden administration, look at it very carefully. Of course, very hopeful that my now former Yale colleague, Jake Sullivan, who was teaching here at Yale actually up to last week, that as National Security Advisor, he will be able to look at these things in depth rather quickly and change course in terms of American policy. But then finally, and this is in conclusion, Bartley, a bit more about the US side of this equation. So to me, as I spell out very clearly in the piece that I just attempted to send a link for, that was published by Foreign Affairs Today, I see domestic policy and foreign policy in the United States as being more linked today than what we probably ever seen before, even during the first phase of the Cold War. The basic cause of America's trouble, in my view, isn't its relative decline in international terms, or the trouble that it has with friends or allies, or maybe not even the rise of China per se. It is in the decline of the United States domestically, in terms of how its political system is run, and in terms of what it does for ordinary citizens within its own borders. I do find that this is perhaps the most frightening aspect that I see in terms of the power shift scenarios, is how quickly the inability to fund common purposes has developed on the US side, to the point that they're not even able to handle the kind of public health crisis that COVID-19 has presented us with in any way, with any way similar success to what you have in much poorer countries abroad. This is, of course, something that's been going on for some time, the gradual reduction in the strength and capabilities of the US government, both at the federal and at the state level. The decline in US funding for public education, the decline in US funding for research and development, both public and private, the collapsing infrastructure that you have in many parts of the country that do not serve economic purposes well. But in addition to that, maybe first and foremost, attitudes by ordinary people in this country who feel that they are being very poorly looked after by their own governments. I think the election of Donald Trump was in many ways a weathervane with regard to this. Trump got away by blaming others, outsiders, maybe first and foremost China, for America's predicament. I think that the only chance that there is to change this relationship in power shift terms, or indeed the global developments in power shift terms, is for the United States to look after better its own domestic developments, and particularly in ways that makes it clear that ordinary Americans will benefit from these changes in policy. So that's, to me, both a great challenge and a great opportunity that there is there for a Biden administration. It was quite interesting to see this morning in the news we got here that President-elect Biden is planning to name Susan Rice, who was Obama's national security advisor, as chief of his domestic policy staff. I think that's a sign that the president-elect at least gets some of these connections that are there now between foreign policy initiatives and domestic development in the United States. So I think I will simply leave it at that, Bartley, as an introduction, and I'm very happy to come back in discussion later on.
Super. Ulf, would you like to take over now from Beijing and give us a man on the street?
I hope you can hear me. And now I have to find out how you can see me. Let me see. But you can at least hear me, I guess. Okay, wait. I start my video. Okay. I'm not the technical guy. I have to apologize. Thank you so much, Professor Westad, for your very interesting comments. I enjoyed it a lot. I think pretty sure a lot of the people are really think that this is a very educational article you have written. And I think how you say it in America, you nailed it, intellectually nailed it. And it's a really interesting thing. Before I want to ask you some questions, and honestly, normally it's not good for Q&A if I agree so much with you. So when I ask my questions, it's not because I disagree. I just want to start and provoke a discussion, because this is the reason why we are here. But before I do this, I would like to maybe add two things, because you mentioned your experience you had when you haven't been in China recently. And I want to say that I'm coming not from an academic perspective. I'm like a street dog, which is going out each day and trying to sniffing around and get the mood of the country. And when it comes to suppression, I totally agree with you. It really has changed at least super fast in the last 19 months. I have been in China, and it's not only the daily encounter we have with the police that we have to be careful what we are doing. It's getting even harder for our Chinese colleagues. And now I have to be honestly very careful how I phrase it, because we depend on our Chinese producers to get us the interviews. I don't speak Chinese, to get us the people who are critical with the Chinese government. This is even harder. And you can see, we call it like you get, if they are not satisfied with your work, they normally not complaining about our mistakes or they not communicate with me about that. They talking to our Chinese colleagues, because they know they are like the weaker part in our office. They can hurt them more. And it's very simple, it's like you have this occasion of drinking tea with the state council, and then they starting to talk, oh, you have a kid, you want to go, that your kid go to a certain school, and these kind of things. This has been happened in the past, my Chinese colleagues told me that, but this really has increased these kind of not so nice talks. And I want to leave it like this because you never know how secure our conversation is. And on the other thing, I had a very interesting experience recently. There is a new think tank in Beijing, which is basically has only the job to teach and to analyze and to spread the message about Xi thoughts. That's the whole thing. It's a think tank which is founded and financed to tell everybody in China who hasn't got it yet how great Xi's thinking is. So we thought it might be kind of, funny, maybe it's the wrong term, but it's interesting to talk to these people and do an interview. Of course, it's pure propaganda. And what's a striking thing for me was, Xi is just like a figure like God in the society. You can't even talk about him. So I had a professor who was an expert on Xi thoughts, but he tried to avoid to use his name. He wouldn't talk about him. He was so scared. It was like in a Harry Potter movie where you cannot talk about Lord Voldemort, you know? And I said, why are you not talking about, I'm a Xi expert, but Xi is, so he was a very strange interview. At the end of the day, it doesn't make any sense because he didn't want to talk about Xi, but he was an expert on Xi. So this maybe shows you how far the suppression or the tension in the society is going and has changed maybe. The other thing I want to talk about, and then two more things, and then I want to ask you a question about the Cold War and the term of Cold War you're using. It's very interesting because the Chinese, we recently had a background briefing, which is very rare that they invite us to a background briefing. Basically, the Chinese government or the people really in power. For us, it's a black box, to be honest. Nobody knows what Xi really thinks and what is the strategy. Of course, you have the plans and his speeches, but it's very hard to really get an understanding of the inner circle, you know, from at least for I have the feeling. So we had a chance to talk to Deputy Secretary of State, and we were asking him the question, what is going to change with the Biden administration? And his answer was basically, he didn't use the term Cold War because he thinks the term Cold War is an invention by the Trump administration. They like to talk about a Cold War, a bipolar world, like you said. And the Chinese would say, no, this is not the case anymore. You know, we have to talk, and this will be one part of my questions. We have to talk about the role in Europe, you know, totally different thing than back then during the Cold War. This is a different situation now. But he said basically Biden might be even more problematic for us than Trump. Trump was clearly so loud and so outspoken, but he was offending the Western European society so much. It was easy for us to have a good relationship, especially with Germany and other European countries, you know that, because Trump was like question NATO and all these kind of things you were talking about. Now with Biden, it's a harder part for us because he will try to, re-invent the NATO and the alliance, and that might be more difficult for us to not maybe be getting a Cold War, that we have this bipolar world, you know, that the Americans are really able to set this up, because this would be for the Chinese example of strength if they can achieve the American going back to the old good days where they were leading the Western world, which is maybe not the case so much anymore. We can talk about this. This is the second point I want to make. And the last point is about the spirit. I read an article in the New York Times, in the wonderful New York Times, about, they have done, I think it's a couple of months ago, they have done a survey in America and in China. And it's a kind of a survey you can trust in China. And the question they asked, especially younger people, were very simple. Do you believe the best days of your country are ahead? And the mind-blowing thing, maybe not a big surprise, was the huge majority in America said, no, it's over. We are on decline. We are a polarized society, you know, we are not in good shape. And the huge majority in China, opposite answer, the best days are ahead. The times now, like what sometimes Chimes are referring to now, it's payback time, it's revenge for 150 years of humiliation, you know? And this is the spirit here. The spirit clearly is that China believes they are the winner of the financial crisis 2008 clearly, and now they absolutely believe they are the winner of the Corona crisis. And there are a lot of, if you look at the economic terms, clearly you can find some proof in this, you know, in this points they make. So that's what I want to say. Though my question is to you, Professor Westad, you're using the term Cold War. How would a world look like where China has won the Cold War? Thank you so much for listening. And again, pleasure to meet you.
If I could just respond briefly to that, and then we'll let other participants in, I guess, as well, partly for questions and answers. It would be wonderful if Harela could join me in responding to some of those questions that I'm sure we're going to get. So, as you said, I mean, we obviously agree on the description of much of the reality that we see with regard to China, but also international affairs in general. And I must really say, it is a pleasure and a privilege to have a commentator who has served not just in Beijing, but in Washington as well, and therefore knows this intimately. With regard to the question, I think it depends very much, of course, on the time perspective. So what we've seen over the last 4 years, I think, is really a rapid decline of the United States in terms of international affairs. I don't think necessarily the Trump administration has sped up the domestic decline of the United States in economic and social terms. It may have done it to some extent, but not overall. It's international decline that I think is most striking. And of course, if nothing is done to try to resurrect America's place in the world overall, then I think we would have a scenario, say 5-6 years from now, when China is going to be much more influential in terms of global international affairs, never mind the region, than what it has been before. And then, of course, the outcome of that will be entirely dominated by the current thinking that's going on within the Xi Jinping leadership in Beijing, which is pretty hard line in terms of setting China first. It doesn't necessarily, I mean, even under Xi, want to overturn the international institutions and the international regulations that have been put in place as a sort of gradual development of what we could call international society coming out of the 19th century and then particularly after the Second World War, during the predominance of the United States. But it wants to get as much as possible for China within that system. So that's where the change is going to be, I think, if this happens quickly. I also worry very much about the region, as I said in my presentation. I think if the idea, the perception of American international decline continues under the Biden administration, I think you will see a much more forceful Chinese approach to questions and issues that have to do with its neighbors. Harder line towards Japan, harder line on the Korean Peninsula, harder line with regard to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and maybe especially with regard to Southeast Asia and the South China Sea issues, or for that matter, the Himalayas, in terms of the conflict with India. And that's what I'm fearful of. I mean, that is what could lead to a conflict. If we think in a somewhat longer perspective, say now, that a Biden administration and its successor administration would be able to do more to resurrect America's influence and position, maybe first and foremost with regard to Eastern Asia, but with regard to Europe as well. Even if China's global power continues to increase, I think the circumstances would be different. China would have to be more collaborative, more cooperative over a longer period of time to get what they would like to see. Now, conflict is not off the table even with that scenario. But I do think that the longer this takes, the longer it takes for the rest of us to socialize China into a framework of international interaction, which is not just about itself, then better are the chances that we will have a safer future, I think, for all of us. Just as a final point, I'm not just saying this with regard to China. I think for a very long time, Europe, Western Europe especially, and then the early form of the Federal Republic of Germany, played a very important role in socializing the United States into behaving less as a go-it-alone superpower and develop the kind of interactivity that really created both a successful outcome of the Cold War, but also created quite a unique scenario for international cooperation up to quite recently. So this is not just about the power itself, it's also what it encounters abroad.
Thank you. Basically, one question a listener is asking us is a follow-up to the region. You just have elaborated a little bit about how China starts to gain strength and playing a different role. If you look at Hong Kong, what happened in Hong Kong and what they have done in Hong Kong to the two system, one country structure, they basically got rid of it, And if you look what they have done to Hong Kong and put this in perspective to Taiwan, we have been many times to Taiwan, and honestly, people are really scared of what kind of war. It doesn't have to be invading the country, but you're an expert. There are many ways of destabilizing the region. If you look to the things Xi Jinping has said, do you believe this is going on to destabilize the region and really trying to get rid of democracy in Taiwan?
What is a short-term scenario, unlike some of the other conflict scenarios that I'm in many ways more worried about? The reason I'm saying that is that I have a strong sense, not least from my stay in Beijing last year, that much of the Chinese power apparatus, not least in the military, do not feel that the time is ripe for that kind of operation. I think they're entirely right. Any attempt, in spite of the waywardness of American foreign policy, any attempt to coerce Taiwan militarily would lead to an absolute disaster. It's very important, not least in Beijing, to keep repeating that Taiwan is not Hong Kong. Taiwan is, among other things, relatively easy to mobilize and armed to the teeth. The destruction for China as a whole that any kind of military operation against Taiwan could lead to would be immense. But of course, there are also those who are saying, more sensible voices, saying, a military operation will not be necessary. If China does become the overall predominant power within its region, it can just gradually squeeze Taiwan in a direction that makes some kind of reunification under Beijing's auspices entirely necessary. I think that's possible. It might even be unavoidable in the longer run. But then the question again is about time, and it's about when it actually happens. I think the best bet for people in Taiwan at the moment is status quo. And in the long term, the best bet is change on the mainland. Change in the direction that will make some kind of affiliation between the two, which I think at some point will happen, to make that into a much better deal for Taiwan than what it would be under the current circumstances. So I know many of my Taiwanese friends are saying that that's entirely wishful thinking. But on the other hand, the kind of China that we're looking at today, compared to the China that I first met in the 1970s, might also seem to be wishful thinking, right? So it does depend on the timing of the processes, I think. But what is clear is that any attempt to use force now and for some time into the future would have disastrous consequences.
It's very interesting for me, if I understood you right, Professor, that you believe political change in China is possible. And my experience, to say so, is that I had the feelings, the whole idea of engagement, when you saw, even if it's Pompeo and the Trump administration, I think he had a point when he gave the speech at the Nixon Library about engagement, and engagement is over, and was wishful thinking to change the system when you engage the system. So, but you believe political change is possible, and why do you believe? Where do you see today in Chinese society under Xi Jinping any hints that this is possible?
So I think it depends very much on what happens in China in social and economic terms. I think for the time being, you're entirely right in saying this, the Chinese Communist Party's regime is pretty entrenched. Though I'm not 100% certain that Xi Jinping's own personal role within it is quite as entrenched as many people think. It is important to be aware that he is still the first among equals, though he is a more powerful first than any Chinese leader have been for a long time. And if he has a complete falling out, which I could foresee under certain circumstances, with other powerful leaders within the party, he would not be able to go it alone. He doesn't have that kind of power. China is a dictatorship, but it's still a party dictatorship, not a personal dictatorship. So in terms of what could upset the apple cart in a broader sense, I think a severe economic downturn would hack away at the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, possibly in ways that they could survive. But it is striking, and you know this, of course, better than me, how much of their current legitimacy is based not just on nationalism, which is a part of it, but also on continuous economic progress. So if they can't deliver on that, then I think there could be challenges coming up, particularly within the regions. Overall, I must also say that I really wonder what's going to happen in China over the next 3 to 4 years. It seems to me that in economic terms, innovation terms, reform, transformation terms, the current regime has to some extent run out of ideas. And it was quite striking when I was in Beijing last year to hear quite a number of people who are otherwise loyal to the regime, very sotto voce, sort of indicating that this is last chance saloon for Chinese reform. And if it doesn't happen now, it's probably not going to happen. And China is going to revert to being a much more state-centered, less competitive, even less innovative, big economy. And I think there is a point in that. Now, the good thing perhaps from Xi's perspective is that some of his closest advisors seem to see this as well. And they are trying to push a broader reform agenda. So far, not so much has come out of it. So we'll see over the next few years.
Back to our audience, and a couple of questions are about Europe. And we haven't talked, you have a little bit talked about Europe. And basically the question our audience is, should Europe reinvest in a relationship with the United States? Or should it maybe try to stay kind of neutral? Is this possible? Because there are huge economic dependencies with China.
I think there's also a two-level question in a way. I mean, I'm in no doubt whatsoever that the alliance with the United States has served Europe well for the past 2 generations. And in terms of its institutions, its organizations, is going to continue to serve Europe well for some time. China is not in a position to sort of replace the United States with regard to its influence in Europe. Nor does it aim to do so, I think, in the shorter run, to be fair. So I do think that the continuation of that relationship, maybe especially in security and trade terms, is important. But on the other hand, as I said in my initial presentation, the world is becoming more multipolar. And in a multipolar world, you have to have your own legs to stand on. You cannot identify entirely with another pole, with another part of the world, the way Europe has had a tendency to identify with the United States, at least on bigger issues, ever since the end of the Second World War. That time, I think, is gone. That doesn't necessarily need to mean a deterioration in terms of cooperation, but it needs that it is necessary that Europe develops capacities, including capacities for its own defense, that go much further than what it has been able to present so far. I mean, one of the things that I think we should learn from history is that in multipolar systems, your value as an ally and even as an ideological friend only go as far as being able to connect in a positive sense to that other pole or that other power. I think that's also true for Europe today. I think it's really, really important that Europeans think about this. What it means, of course, is deeper European integration, but it also means an ability to defend itself and an ability to develop its own foreign policies. Maybe particularly with regard to Russia and China, but also further afield.
I have maybe looking at the time, maybe one more question, and I hope it's a fun question, it's a tricky question. For example, our Chancellor Angela Merkel would give you a call in the middle of the night, a very famous night call, and ask you for advice. And he said, Professor Westad, I really have a problem. I need an intellectual maybe to solve a problem. You know, we are close to sign a deal with China about the European Investment Treaty, which is very important for our economy. But I get constantly calls from Joe Biden, president-elect, and he says, don't do it, don't do it. And if you do it, think about your national security, depend heavily on America. And then I get maybe 10 minutes later a call from President Xi, and he tells me, you have to do it, you have to do it. Think about your car industry. If you're not signing this treaty, or if you're not leading Europe to signing the treaty, I'm going to destroy your car industry, which basically means you have like social instability. So Professor Westad, I'm kind of looking for advice. What should I do?
That's the famous elevator pitch that I always prepare my students for in case they at any point get close enough to power to be relevant. So I would tell the Bundeskanzler that the most important thing to look out for is to make sure that Europe invests in increased globalization and in increased international and finance links with other parts of the world, including China. And I think in a situation like this, of course, it does come down, as I say in this new piece that's just out in Foreign Affairs, to the conditions and the conditionalities. So if China proposes, as it has done at some points in the past, though not so much with regard to Europe, financial, economic, trade deals, maybe particularly investment deals, that are exclusively to China's advantage in a strategic sense, Europe, of course, should turn that down. Germany should turn that down. But if the issue is, as it probably is going to be more often, that the United States, and probably some other countries as well, would try to prevent Germany or Europe from setting up the kind of trade and investments deals that Europeans really feel would serve their own economies well with China, then I think that kind of American pressure should be resisted, even if there are threats. And I think that's possible even under a Biden administration, that this would have negative effects for the US-Europe security cooperation. And the reason why I'm saying this is that Europe, more than anywhere else in the world, has a very high stake in allowing free trade, in furthering avenues for investment and economic cooperation, irrespective of what the relationship between the leading powers in strategic terms is in a global sense, of course, short of war. I think that's one of the most important lessons from history. So if Europe becomes the kind of ally to the United States that would necessarily think that it cannot have an open relationship with the rest of the world in economic terms, because it wouldn't serve Europe well in terms of its security relationship with the United States. Then, unfortunately, the only conclusion to draw, I think, is that there is something fundamentally wrong with that security relationship. So I think this is important, not just for Germany, but for other countries. And part of what I'm saying here is, Europe needs to be able to stand on its own feet with regard to these kinds of decisions. It has a fundamental interest in continue to working with the United States, but on its own conditions, just like it has a fundamental interest in linking up not just to China, but to the Eastern Asian region, which for at least a generation, if not two, is going to be the most dynamic economic region on Earth.
That was the interesting thing is we will find out very soon if she takes your advice, because they have to sign it if you want to sign it this month. And I think they're around middle in the really intense negotiations. And I think they face exactly this question. Yeah. And I hope you're right. I maybe have one more to look at the watch. Maybe I have the chance to ask you one more question. Thank you so much. The world, when we don't like the world we live in, we have to complain about ourselves. This world is made by the elite. This is something which the Trump administration got right, I think, and the elite about wonderful institutions. You represent the Yale, Harvard, the Ivy League. If you look at the really close advisors from Xi Jinping, it's so striking for me that most of them really are educated in America. If you look at his economic advisor, Lee Ho, he's a Harvard graduate, so they know each other very well. So if we don't like the world, we have to complain about ourselves because we didn't do a good job. This brings me to my question. Why should a guy in West Virginia, I've been many times in West Virginia during the 2015 or 2016 election, why should he care about the Cold War, and why should he care about the Chinese-American relationship? When you talk to these guys, they say, I couldn't care less. It has nothing to do with my world. Nobody is going to attack America. So why should we live in a globalized world? I have no benefit from it. I don't see it. My world is dying. The last 20 years, it's getting worse, worse, worse. All this argument. What would you answer him?
I think the only response possible to that is to have an administration in Washington who not just says, but actually does look after some of the interests of our friend in West Virginia or elsewhere across the United States. And I think that's the reason why this incoming administration has to prioritize that bond that is so crucial between governments, or to some extent between elites in general, and ordinary people within a country. That's what's been broken in the United States. That's why we got Trump. That's why we had 72 million people still after the past 4 years who voted for Trump this year. And that problem is not going to go away. It is in a way a little bit similar to what you have in China. So when I was traveling last year, it was quite interesting to see, particularly when you got further away from Beijing, ordinary people, I like to do like you. I mean, I go out to, we still could do that, to bars and to restaurants and to entertainment sites and talk to people. And the sense I got was that many of these people were saying, well, they're very proud of their country. They're very proud that China is doing well. But it's even more important what this will mean for them. And for quite a number of people, I think the sense is that things have not been developing in a positive direction for them personally as fast as they would have liked. Right? Things are still heading up. So there isn't the kind of crisis that you find with our guy in West Virginia. But they have reason to ask the question, why so much fuss about belts and roads, while, some of the conditions that we live under locally, particularly if you happen to be a first generation working class guy who just got started, on the development of his own productivity and his ability to save. Why should so much money go out of China rather than being spent at home? So I think this is something that you will see over the next half generation, I think in all countries, including in Europe. And the answer to this, in this broader sense, non-specific sense, is of course that any government, worth its salt at this point, will have to look after its own population first. I mean, if not, they're going to lose out in terms of legitimacy. And this is so. I've been saying this a lot in this country. If the lesson that the new administration here draws from the defeat of the Trump administration is that this form of Trumpism or nationalism is dead, is going away, then they get things entirely wrong. I think that will remain, and it will be a big challenge, as we see in Europe now as well, to restore that relationship between those who govern and those who are being governed.
Yeah, and you clearly, absolutely, you can see that the income gap in China is getting really a problem. And basically, in many ways, you refer to that, is China a pretty similar society like America? Maybe the advantage that it hasn't been so developed, but you clearly see where it's going, So you have these global losers, absolutely. My final question, I always ask when I had the chance to talk to super smart people, is, and it's coming up Christmas, is besides the wonderful book you have written, and I promise that I'm going to get a copy and going to read it because I liked your article so much, is if you could recommend one book this year, we should most definitely read because it's really explaining the world, how the world is and what the problems are, and maybe even what the solutions can be.
So I think if you look at the international system and how it works and some of the challenges that are within it, surprise the organizers here, I don't think you can do much better than the first volume of Barack Obama's autobiography. I think both because it's beautifully written, President Obama is a great writer, but more than that, and perhaps a little bit against himself, because he lays bare all the structural challenges that are there in actually getting things done, even with the best will in the world. Whatever you can say about President Obama, in most respects, he's a man of tremendous goodwill, but also someone, this he probably wouldn't agree with, failed in terms of doing many of the things that he wanted to do. And I think it's rare to find a memoir that lays out so clearly why that was the case. So if there's one book that has come out this year, I would recommend that is probably the one.
Wonderful. And I want to add another book. It's Dreams from My Father. This is a book Obama has written when he was 35 and became the head of the Harvard Law Review. And the wonderful thing is, if you really want to top that, get it as an audiobook, because he's reading it. He got an Emmy for that. This guy is really gifted, like you are. Thank you so much, Professor. It was a pleasure to talk to you. I hope that the people enjoyed the conversation. I enjoyed it very much. And I wish you all the best. And whenever you're coming to Beijing, you have a place to stay. And I would like to invite you to dinner. And maybe I get a chance to do even an interview with you for the next documentary. It would be wonderful. It was a pleasure to meet you, sir.
I'm much looking forward to that. Thank you again for posing such wonderful questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, these are the audience questions. Okay.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. So I want to thank you both. That was wonderful. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for giving us your time. I know we have gone slightly over, and you have been both so generous